In 2024, I set out to read 24 books. It's October and I completed that goal this week. Let's recap all 24 books from least favorite to favorite. Grab a warm mug and let's get into it. I do use Goodreads to keep track of all my books, and in the past, I just haven't really enjoyed the process of rating a book on a 5-star scale. I just don't like going into a book asking how many stars am I going to give this book. That's not the way that I want to approach reading or the way that is most enjoyable to me. So for 2024, I did not give any star ratings to these books. This is the first time I'm really going through and thinking about what was my favorite, what was maybe a 5-star read, and what falls below that. We're gonna start with nonfiction books. In 2024, I read 5 nonfiction books, starting with my least favorite. Not to say these are bad, just that I enjoyed the other 4 more, was Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg, which was published in 2020. The premise of this book is that when you're looking to establish a new habit, that you start really, really small. Tiny habits. So if I'm looking to run a marathon, I'm just gonna start my habit by waking up and going to put my running shoes on. That's it. That's how I start the habit. This just felt like one of those nonfiction books to me that just doesn't need to be the length of a book. And I remember that it took me a while to get through it too. So I finished this book in April, but I actually started it in November of 2023. So it just moved very slowly for me. And I read it because a friend recommended it. Moving on to 4th place for nonfiction, Try Softer, a fresh approach to move us out of anxiety, stress, and survival mode and into a life of connection and joy by Andi Kobler, published in 2020. So I'm a part of a small group at our church, and this was one of the books we were looking at for the spring semester of 2024, but we actually didn't choose it as our small group book. So I just decided to read it myself, and I finished this book in August. It was short and sweet. It felt like free therapy, and it was just a great reminder to take things slow and be gentler with ourselves. Moving on to the 3rd place for nonfiction, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain, and this was published in 2012. I finished this book in September, so this was very recent. I actually borrowed this book from my brother years ago and hadn't read it, hadn't given it back, and so I was like, I need to read this year. It was very easy to read, very anecdotal. It was well researched and well written for a nonfiction book. I enjoyed it more than the typical nonfiction book, I would say. Moving to 2nd place for the nonfiction books was Making Sense of the Bible by Adam Hamilton, which was published in 2016. This is the book that we did choose to read as a part of our small group, and so I finished this book in May. I thought this was a great comprehensive look at the Bible as a book and also as theology, covering its largest themes and topics that are in 21st century conversation. I also liked that it felt like it presented multiple sides of an argument or multiple historical lenses to look through, which I really appreciated in this world of polarization. And then finally, my favorite nonfiction book that I have read in 2024, The In-Between: Unforgettable Encounters During Life's Final Moments by Hadley Vlahos, published in 2023. I finished this book in June. I had seen Hadley's YouTube channel before and some of the shorts that she had made, and that she had published a book. I enjoyed the story she was telling, so I thought I would check it out. She's a hospice nurse, and it's a telling of her patients' stories in hospice at the end of their lives. It was spiritual in a non-religious way. It was completely captivating, and I cried multiple times throughout the story just because the human experience is so powerful, and the telling of these stories is so powerful. I loved that book. Huge recommendation. Moving on to fiction now, ranked from least favorite to favorite. Coming in number 18, we're gonna have to go with A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas, published in 2021. I finished this book in August. I had previously read the first 4 books in this series, and so at this point, I just wanted to finish out the series. Now, this next part is gonna have spoilers. If you have not read the series and you are planning on it and you do not want spoilers, jump to this timestamp to skip the spoilers for A Court of Silver Flames. So, Cassian and Nesta just give me the ick. I don't like their relationship. Even though they have a redemptive arc, I just could not get behind it. This book was also honestly just a little too spicy for me. When I didn't like the characters, I did not enjoy the spicy scenes, and I just kind of skimmed through them. I enjoyed a lot of the plot. I just didn't enjoy Nesta as the main storyteller, and I didn't realize it was going to be from her point of view, so my expectation that I walked in with was kind of warped once I got, a third into the story and realized that I wasn't gonna get more of Feyre and Rhysand, which was all that I was craving. So it didn't really meet my expectations, and honestly, I didn't really enjoy the characters and their relationship, and so that's coming in 18th for me out of the books that I've read this year. Moving on to number 17, Happy and You Know It by Laura Hankin, published in 2020. This was my 24th book that I read this year, so I finished this in October. I actually originally saw this book in a used bookstore while I was on vacation visiting a friend in March. And usually when I go into a used bookstore, I will get one book, one because I like to support the used bookstores, but not more than one because I don't want to build my physical TBR list too tall. I like to keep it small and only buy books that I'm actually going to read. So I did mark it as to be read on Goodreads, even though I did not buy it that day. And I finally got around to it after getting it at the library. This book felt like a daytime soap opera. It had a very unrealistic plot and non-believable characters. It was still fun to read, but I found myself rolling my eyes a lot. That's all I need to say about that. Coming in at number 16, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, published in 2022. I read this in April. I had heard great things from friends and just people on Goodreads. And honestly, reading this did feel like curling up with a cozy, warm cup of tea or coffee. If cozy fantasy is a genre, I am all behind it. I also love that this was originally self-published and that now it's made its way into the mainstream. I will say it did feel a little simple, sort of like a YA book. Not that that's a bad thing, but it probably didn't meet my expectations going into it. And I was also reading this alongside Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, which these two books, while both in the fantasy genre, have completely different vibes, one being like an epic fantasy and one being this more cozy fantasy. So it was good, but it just wasn't my favorite, and I will not be reading more of the books in the series. Coming in at number 15, Mika in Real Life by Amiko Jean, published in 2022. I read this in March. This is the book that I picked up from that used bookstore. And this is a story about a woman who, 16 years after giving up her daughter for adoption, tries to build a relationship with her. Her life is a mess, and so she fibs a little bit while talking to her daughter. And then the story is about her basically having to cover her tracks, and when her daughter comes to visit, live this lie that she has built up for herself. It is a very heartwarming story of family, and it is full of commentary on familial, cultural, and societal pressures and expectations that we put on people. For number 14, A Court of, what is this? Wind and Ruin? Is that right? By Sarah J. Maas, published in 2017. I read this book in July. At this point, I was completely immersed in the series. I was borrowing this series from a friend, but I was in Toronto when I finished the second book, and so I actually went to this cute little independent bookstore. I think it was called Peter Pan Books, maybe, and had to buy the third in the series. The lady who was checking me out, she asked if I had ever read them before. I said no. She told me it was her favorite in the series, so I had my expectations pretty high. Planning for war and war action books are just not my favorite. I much prefer character-driven with a little drama. The action is just not usually my cup of tea. The book was long and it did slow down a bit for me, but I still was really immersed and enjoying the story. Moving on to number 13, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, published in 2005. I finished this book in August. I actually audiobooked this with my husband on a road trip. We were looking for a book that was available at the library last minute, and this came up, something that I've always wanted to read, something that he had read a couple of times, I think, actually. The way that he describes it is, this is a book for people who love books. And I am one of those people. I love books. So I was pretty excited about this. It is a very clever story, but it is also very involved. I think I would have enjoyed it more had I read a print copy of this. I actually had to read chapter summaries online occasionally just to catch up on the characters that I missed or the small plot points that I missed, because it is just a long story. And when I'm driving and listening to an audiobook, there are inevitably things that I will not catch. Moving on to number 12, A Court of Frost and Starlight. This is the novella in the ACOTAR series, and I finished this in July. It goes after A Court of Wings and Ruin. I thought it was a cute little novella. Not a lot happens, but I was so into the world and the story at this point that I wanted every little crumb that I could get from this novella. So I enjoyed it. Coming in number 11, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, published in 2015. Sarah J. Maas sure is taking up a lot of slots in my 2024 books. So I finished the first book in the series in June, but I actually started in April. I almost DNF'd this because it just felt very slow to me. Once I got to the halfway point though, that's when things started to pick up, and I think I finished the second half of the book in just a few days. And I know that I heard that sentiment from a lot of other people as well. It took me a while to get going in this book. I really enjoyed the last quarter of this book, but I didn't actually ever think I was going to read it, so I had seen and heard a lot of spoilers for the series, so nothing at the end of the book was especially surprising to me because I knew what was going to happen. Coming in at number 10, top 10 for 2024. The Short Secondhand Life of Bree Tanner by Stephanie Meyer, published in 2009. I read this in January because I wanted to reread the Twilight series at the end of 2023, and I read the first 4 books in December. That was a great reread. I love when authors do novellas or spin-offs. I know some people see them as like a cash grab, but as a fan, I want more story, and that's exactly what these are. I want to go deeper into the world, and so I love getting a little snippet of a new character's perspective and their experience in this world. I did read this book probably in 2009 or 2010, but I didn't remember anything about it, so I enjoyed it as if it were a first read. Coming in at number 9, The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams, published in 2021. I read this in April. This was on my to-be-read list for a long time. I don't remember how I first came across it. I had marked it to read over a year ago, and honestly, it was such a heartwarming story about 2 unlikely friends that come together and bond over this reading list. The story progresses as they read through the books that are on this list. This is an 8-book list. I will say I had only read 3 of the books that were on this list. They're all like classics. And I think I would have had a better understanding of the story if I had knew more about all 8 of the books that were on the reading list. Moving to number 8, Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, published in 2012. Don't worry, I don't have the entire Throne of Glass series listed as the top 7. I read this in September. Honestly, I was just a little bit disappointed about A Court of Silver Flames, and ACOTAR was the only Sarah J. Maas series that I had read so far, so I wanted to try a different series, and honestly, I loved Throne of Glass. I enjoyed the quick pace and the story more than I enjoyed the first book in the ACOTAR series, and I would love to continue reading this series. I just have to wait 8 weeks at the library for the next book to come in because it is super popular right now. I mentioned this one earlier, coming in at number 7, Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, published in 2020. I finished this book in April. This book is huge. I started it in July of 2023 and then restarted it 2 more times after initially starting it. This is my husband's favorite series. It's the fourth book in the series. And so I wanted to read it to enjoy what he enjoys and share in that together. It is an epic fantasy, which I love, but I am not into war stories, war planning, like I said before. And I'm not super into long descriptions of action sequences. Of course, this book is amazing and I love Brandon Sanderson and the world building is just top tier, but there were just books that I read this year that I connected with more. So moving on to number 6, Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer, published in 2020. I finished this in January during my reread of the entire Twilight series. However, this was the only book that I had never read before because it was published in 2020, whereas the other books were published in like the 2008, 2009 zone. Stephanie Meyer had started this book at that time, but like a good portion of the book was leaked onto the internet. It was a huge drama of the time. She said that she wasn't going to finish it or that she was going to finish it once it kind of blew over. And so in 2020, all of the fans got their wish and she published Midnight Sun. I thought this was so fun. And my little teenage self that's still inside my brain was so happy to finally get to read this story after waiting over, 14 years? Moving into the top 5 of books. Coming in at number 5, I actually put these 2 books together, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros, published in 2023. They were both published in 2023. I couldn't remember where one stopped and the other one began, and I read them so quick together that to me, they're just one story and one book. I finished Fourth Wing in April and Iron Flame in May. So this was the first like book talk book that I read this year. It's actually what made me want to read the ACOTAR series. I had just heard so much about it that I wanted to be part of the conversation. At times, this was a little too spicy for me, I cannot lie, but I do love the mindless romantasy. I don't even care how good the story is, how well thought out the plot is, if there's plot holes. Sometimes I just want to veg out, have a story with some twists and turns, and these books were perfect for that. Moving on to book number 4, the last time that I will say Sarah J. Maas's name. A Court of Mist and Fury, published in 2016. I finished this in July, and I heard it was better than the first book, which is why I decided to pick it up. I did want to see where the story continued. This was my favorite book in the series, which I hear from a lot of people, except for that lady at the bookstore. It was so fast-paced, even though it's so many pages long, it just kept me wanting to read, which is my favorite characteristic of a book. If I am at work and all I want to do is read your book, you are top tier. You have succeeded in the publishing world. And now for the top 3 books in 2024 in the fiction category. Number 3, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, published in 2022. I read this book in May. A friend had recommended it. I had heard such great things about it. I had high expectations for this book. It did not disappoint. Another heartwarming story of family and life with the added bonus of a story about one of the coolest creatures on this earth, the octopus. After I read this book, I could not get enough that I actually watched an entire octopus documentary on Disney+. I don't want to give any spoilers, but if you have not read Remarkably Bright Creatures, this has got to be at the top of your list. Coming in with a silver medal at number 2, Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, published in 2023. I read this book in September after my dad got it for my birthday for me in July. This is my first of Ann Patchett's novels. I had actually never heard of her before this, but I will be reading more. I am obsessed with everything about this book. It is set during the pandemic, which I think would turn a lot of people off, but I think was done so well. I listened to most of this book on a multi-day bike trip, and it was a perfect companion to just be out in nature, listening to this story being told by Meryl Streep. I love a good story about a movie star, and reminiscing of a past relationship where hindsight is 2020. Love it. Tom Lake is definitely my fall recommendation for anyone looking for a new book. And with the gold medal, coming in at number 1, my favorite book that I read in 2024, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, published in 2022. I read this in July. I had heard amazing things about it, and I loved every second of it. I wish I could read this again for the first time. I don't think that I have ever felt so emotionally connected to fictional characters in a book. I felt heartbreak and heartache while reading this book. And that is such a testament to the writing because I don't even really have a lot in common with these characters. While reading, I really wanted the story to go in one direction, but the author took it in a different direction, and she convinced me that her way was right. That story was beautiful, and it earned the spot at the top of my rankings list for the 24 books that I read in 2024. I hope that maybe you found a new book recommendation to read this fall or this winter. Let me know if you've read any of these books and if you agree or disagree with my thoughts, whether something should have been ranked higher or lower than I thought it should have. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.